Here we go. You will have a chance to ask your own questions. But what about the name? Why did you change your name to write books to
Well,
David
when I
Cornwell?
began writing, I was what was politely called a foreign servant. And I went to my employers and said that I'd written my first novel, and they read it, and they said they had no objection to it. But even if it were about butterflies, they said, I would have to choose a pseudonym. So I then went to my publisher, Victor Golanks, who was Polish by origin. His name ended in CZ. And Victor said, my advice to you, old fellow, is choose a good Anglo-Saxon couple of syllables, monosyllables, he said. He suggested something like Chunk Smith. So, as is my courteous way, I promised to be Chunk Smith and then sent... And after that, memory eludes me, and the lie takes over. I was asked so many times why I chose this ridiculous name.
I'm sorry to have been one of the number.
Yeah. And then the writer's imagination came to my help. And I saw myself riding over Battersea Bridge on the top of a bus and looking down and seeing a tailor's shop. Funnily enough, it was a tailor's shop because I had a terrible obsession about buying clothes in order to become a diplomat in Bonn. And it was called something of this sort, I said. And that satisfied everybody for years. But lies don't last with age. I find a frightful compulsion towards truth these days.
And the truth is that?
And the truth is I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's a good way to start everything here, isn't it? What was the intelligence service you were in, incidentally?
Well, I never... Even now, some residual sense of loyalty prevents me from talking much about it. I entered the secret world when I was very young. I kind of lurched into it. There really never seemed an alternative to it. I was first picked up when I was a young student in Bern. I ran away from my first school. And then I retained what is politely called a reporting responsibility. And then for my military service, I served in Austria. And that was a very formative time because one of my jobs was trawling through the displaced persons camps, looking for people who were fakes, perhaps, fake refugees, or for people whose circumstances were so attractive to us from an intelligence point of view that we might consider returning them with their consent to the countries they came from. And for a person of, as I was then, barely 21, it was an immense responsibility and an extraordinary moment in history, in retrospect, which, horrible as it was, I was very pleased to have shared.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, after teaching at Eton, I went into the Cold War setup properly. And in all, I don't suppose that I spooked around for more than about 7 or 8 years, and that's 40 years ago. But that was my little university for the purposes that I needed later to write. And I think if I'd gone to sea for that time, I would have written about the sea. If I'd gone into advertising or stockbroking, that would have been my start.
Heaven help us.
And it was from there, I'm going on, but it's just an important, I think, and it was from there that I began abstracting and peopling my other world, my alternative private world, which became my patch. And it became a kind of Tolkien-like operation, except that none of my characters had hair between their toes.
Was there a moment during all of this when you really felt that you were going to write about it? Was there an epiphany, a moment?
Yeah. There was. I had the curious and very rewarding example when I was in the first of the 2 services that I joined, the security service, of working with a man called John Bingham, whose real name was Lord Clan Morris. And he was a thriller writer, and he was also an extremely good intelligence officer, and he was a molish, tubby fellow. And he not only gave me the urge to write, but he gave me a kind of outline of George Smiley, which I later filled in from other sources, notably my own, but he and a Don at Oxford, whom I knew very well, became parts of this composite character called Smiley.
Did you find it easy to do? Did you
Yeah.
have great confidence in setting off to be a writer suddenly?
I have a great debt of gratitude to the press for this, because in those days English newspapers were much too big to read on the train. And so instead of fighting with my colleagues to read the Times newspaper, I could write in little notebooks. And I lived a long way out of London. The line has since been electrified, which is a great loss to literature. But in those days, it was an hour and a half each way. And I learned then, too, something very important, that to give the best of the day to your work is most important. So if I could write for an hour and a half on the train, I was already completely jaded by the time I got to the office to start work. Then there was a resurgence of talent during the lunch hour. And in the evening again, something came back to me. So I was always very careful to give my country second best.
So what sort of things were you writing in these little notebooks?
I was writing the very first book without any kind of skeleton, without any conscious model, but with this odd character of George Smiley to go along with me. I've never been able to write a book without one very strong character in my rucksack. And the moment I had Smiley as a figure with that past and that memory and that uncomfortable private life and that excellence in his profession, I knew I had something that I could live with and work with.
So you always start with this image of character rather than, say, a plot?
Yeah, usually somebody. I mean, in fact, I can't remember setting off on my travels without having some picture of a character to take with me. I mean, really as a companion. I was traveling in northeast Laos to write a book called The Honourable Schoolboy. And we were stuck up in Laos, I was, with David Greenway from the Boston Globe. And the train came in, and we had to make a frightful journey to somewhere. And he turned to me and said, which class would Smiley travel uncomfortably? So I said he'd definitely be in that one with the wonderful washing urns and all of that. He'd mix with the natives. He said, I tell you what we'll do. We'll put Smiley in there and we'll travel first class.
You have a lovely story about the germination of a spy who came in from the cold,
Yes.
I believe, at Heathrow Airport.
That's right. That was just, at that time I was very much caught up in the Cold War in Germany. And I was stationed in Bonn, going to Berlin a lot, and that was the crucible of all that spy commerce that was going on in those days. And I brought over to one of my jobs in the embassy, one of my day jobs, as you might say, I was bringing over German dignitaries and introducing them to British politicians and functioning as interpreter and whatnot. I was sitting alone in London Airport and minding my own business when a very rough-edged kind of Trevor Howard figure walked in and sat himself at the bar beside me and fished in his pocket and put down a great handful of change, denominations from heaven knows which different currencies, and said a large scotch. And between him and the barman, they just sorted out the money. And he drank the scotch and left. And he had a very slight Irish accent, which I felt I picked up. And that was really all, but there was a deadness in the face. And he looked, as we would have said in the spy world in those days, as if he'd had the hell posted out of him. And it was suddenly, it was the embodiment of somebody that I'd been looking for. And it was he, and I never spoke to him, but he was my guy. He was Alec Lemus.
The Paris Review always asks these questions about working habits. I think you said, you talked about being on the train, going out on a job and then coming back. What is your working day like now?
Well, I still don't type. I write by hand, and my wife types everything out. And endlessly, repeatedly. And I correct by hand too. I'm an absolute monk about my work. I believe it's like being an athlete. You've got to find out which are the best hours of the day. I'm a morning person. I like to drink in the evening, go to sleep on a good idea, and wake up with the idea solved or advanced. I believe in sleep. Then I go straight to work, often very early. If a book's getting to the end of its run, I'll start at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and go through till lunchtime. Then I'll take a walk in the afternoon, and over a scotch, maybe look at the stuff that Jane's typed out, and fiddle with it a bit more. But always try to go to sleep before you've finished working, just a little bit before. Yes, I know where I'll go tomorrow morning, but not quite knowing what you're going to do when you go. And then in the morning it seems to deliver the answer. And for the last few years I live only in the deep country, and I've always kept away from writers, the lit set. I'd much rather talk to the woodcutter than a fellow writer. I like the primary material. I don't like exchanging ideas much. I don't, believe it or not, much like talking about my work. And I'm a total bore, actually.